disease, Parkinson's disease, and multiple sclerosis impacts sleep and vigilance, affecting... C'est bon, ça me fera une révision. Good afternoon. I'm Isabelle Arnulf from the Paris Brain Institute and a neurologist at Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital. It's my pleasure to introduce this conference, which is common to the Paris Brain Institute and the Prada Foundation. The human brain has a major weakness. It is prone to fatigue. Recent data indicates that cognitive fatigue corresponds to the intrusion of local sleep-like patterns of neural activity in the awake brains. Plus, we know that nighttime sleep consolidates memory. The brain damages that we see in neurological disorders, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and multiple sclerosis, impact sleep and vigilance, affecting the patient's quality of life. Conversely, altered sleep may worsen cognitive disturbance and contribute to neurodegeneration. It's what we plan to show you this afternoon for this symposium on neurodegenerative disorder and sleep. And for the first speaker, I will start with Thomas Andrillon. Thomas Andrillon is a researcher at the Paris Brain Institute, and is specialized in local sleep. He will speak about the role of sleep in cognition and fatigue. Thomas, thank you.
Thanks, Isabelle, for the kind introduction, and thanks to the Fondazione Prada for organizing this event. I hope that the presentations will be clear, although we are remote and online. I'm sure if there are some technical glitches, there will be people to manage this end. So today I will talk about this phenomenon of local sleep and its connection with cognitive fatigue. And I hope this will give you ideas and perspectives about how this could apply and be very relevant to a neurodegenerative disease, which is an angle of research we are pursuing here at the Paris Brain Institute. But before diving into this, I think it's very important to talk about this phenomenon of local sleep and what does it mean. So this concept of local sleep comes in opposition to a certain extent to the classical view of sleep, which sees very much sleep as and wakefulness as a mutually exclusive phenomenon. So if you open, for example, a textbook about sleep physiology, you always have this contrast between wake activity, which I depicted here, which is usually characterized by a global state of activation at the level of the brain, whereby brain regions show fast, desynchronized, low amplitude activity. So you can see pretty much as every brain region doing something a little bit different together, just like an orchestra where you have different instruments playing a different partition, and it's a combination of this partition that will make the music of the brain and allow us for the great variability of cognitive processes we're able to maintain while awake. In contradiction, when we're in deep sleep, especially slow wave sleep, brain activity completely changes. And this state is usually associated with this eponymous high amplitude slow waves that I have depicted here, that show a phenomenon of hypersynchrony at the level of the brain. At the neuronal level, it corresponds to alternances between state of activation and states of silence. Very importantly, what you can see from this drawing here is that a lot of different brain regions and a lot of different neurons will do the same thing at the same time. Pretty much as if your brain orchestra will suddenly play the same tune in unison. And in that case, the music you can generate is not very varied, and therefore the kind of things you can do as a brain will not be very varied. And it is because of this switch in terms of dynamics from desynchronized activity to hypersynchronous activity that sleep will be characterized by this incapacity to respond to the environment, to respond to external stimuli, but also these states of unconsciousness that is a characteristic of dreamless sleep. Now that is a classical view, but the problem is here we are looking at two extrema, when we are perfectly awake and when you're deeply asleep. It emerges from recent findings in the sleep field that sometimes you can be in between, and sometimes you can be in states that will share characteristic of sleep and wakefulness. For example, it has been shown that during the night, some brain region can locally wake up. So the rest of the brain will be asleep. The person will be behaviorally asleep. You have all the behavioral signs of sleepiness. People are not moving. They're still in their bed. Breathing is slow. Cardiac rhythm is slow. But suddenly you can notice the brain region waking up. And these local awakenings could be associated with this phenomenon of local sleep and could help people or restore some cognitive functions. Like, for example, we see this sort of local awakenings with sleepwalking, where suddenly sleepers are able to walk around and do things. So there is a possibility that at a given time, the brain is not displaying the same activity in terms of sleep or wake dynamics. So this has been first studied within sleep with this local modulation of sleep depth. What I'm going, and this is an example of this sort of thing. So where, for example, here, the gray area that is highlighted here is this type of local awakenings in a context of sleep. So other parts of the brain show this high amplitude slow wave that are characteristic of sleep, but then at the same time in motor cortices, you have a local awakening. So showing this possibility of sleep to be local. And then you have the reverse phenomenon on which I will talk more about today, which is during the day, how you can have the reverse dynamics where most of the brain is awake, the individual is awake, they have eyes open, they are doing things, but suddenly you can find a brain region showing a pattern of activity that is reminiscent of sleep. So this high amplitude slow wave that will happen locally in both time and space. So this sleep intrusion within wakefulness have been first characterized in animals, where we have the option, the possibility to record from within the brain. So for example, we have shown that if you sleep deprived rats, there is an occurrence of this localized slow wave. They correlate with this silences of neurons. They increase the more the time you spend awake, and they will be predictive of your capacity to of your propensity to make errors. So they can explain in a way when you get sleep deprived why suddenly you're not as good as you are in terms of objective performance. And they do that in what we call the region-specific fashion. So if a brain region is involved in a task, then observing this sleep intrusion within that region can help you predict the behavior, but not in other brain regions that are not involved in the task. And that's the panel you can see here. So when rats are missing here a pellet of food they are supposed to grab, then this is associated with more of this sleep intrusion in the frontal cortices, so a brain region involved in that task, but you don't have this distinction in brain regions that are not involved. So it's really the power of this sleep intrusion to help you determine precisely not only when we are making errors, but what kind of errors we're about to make. So I recently tried to push this concept a bit further and to adapt it first from animal to humans. So trying to see if this sort of sleep intrusion also occur in humans. Another thing I wanted to do was to examine whether these sleep intrusions are only occurring in extreme cases of sleep deprivation, when we're really preventing an individual to sleep and pushing its brain to its limits, or whether they could happen to you and me going about a normal day, whether it's an everyday phenomenon in a way. So to investigate this, which work I did when I was in Australia at Monash University, was to examine 3 types of information altogether. First type of information is behavior. We ask normal individuals to do a task in which they have to pay attention to the external world. Then we record their physiology through electroencephalography. So we record the activity of the brain while they are doing the task. And then we record their phenomenology. So we interrupt them from time to time and ask them about what they have, what's ongoing in their minds. Are they focusing on the task? Are they thinking about something else? So in practice, what does it look like is we use typical experiments used to test attention. So we ask people to, for example, in the digits version, to pay attention to a series of digits on the screen. And all they have to do is to press a button each time they see a new digit, except if that new digit is the digit 3, in which case they have to withdraw, to withhold their response. So it's a very simple task. But to do it well, you need to continuously pay attention to what's in front of you. Then from time to time, we ask them whether they are task focused, whether they are thinking about something else, which we call mind wandering, or whether they have a blank and they think about nothing, which we call mind blanking. So we did that in 26 healthy adults. And we first replicated results that are very frequent in the investigation of mind wandering, which is that in this context of boring tasks, to be honest, people are paying attention only half of the time. So individual dots are individual results. So there is quite large variability, but on average, people pay attention to the task only half of the time. The rest of the time, they're either thinking about something else, mind wandering, or thinking about nothing, mind blanking. This attentional state has an impact on performance. Obviously, if you think about something else or if you think about nothing, you're less good at doing your task. You are making more errors. Interestingly, it has also an impact on the speed. When you are thinking about something else, you get faster. You're a bit impulsive. When you think about nothing, you get slower. You're a bit sluggish. What we wanted to understand is what in the brain leads to these different types of error, being too impulsive or being too slow. What's very interesting for us is that both correspond to a state of low vigilance. And this is something we can record either objectively by measuring the size of the pupil. Usually when the pupil size reduces, people are less aroused, more sleepy. But it's also something we can monitor by asking directly to people when we interrupt them. We ask them, are you feeling sleepy or not? And we see that even when they are behaviorally impulsive, they feel sleepy and they are objectively sleepy. So we have a state of sleepiness that can lead to opposite consequences. Sometimes you get too fast and sometimes you get too slow. So how can we explain that? What could be the neural mechanism that could explain that at times you go too fast and at times you go too slow? Our hypothesis is that slow waves, because they are local phenomena, could actually explain both kind of events. So what we did was to detect these slow waves, and this is what they look. So you have the classical example of sleep slow waves, so the kind of slow wave your brain will spontaneously produce when you're asleep, that are typically very large, very synchronized, and we have their wake equivalents. You can see from the scale here of the y-axis that they are much smaller, but they otherwise reproduce a lot of the properties of this slow wave, especially they have this large negative component that is associated with the episode of neuronal silencing in animal recordings. So these waves really look like there could be this phenomenon of sleep intrusion, and they could represent a pause in neuronal firing while you're awake and doing something. Interestingly, this wave that we record non-invasively through just a set of electrodes placed on the head of participants are a good marker of fatigue. So they correlate well with pupil size. The smaller the pupil size, the more you have these waves. And they correlate also with subjective ratings. So the more people declare themselves sleepy, the more will record this slow wave. So they're a good marker, and that could potentially be used to actually track sleepiness above and beyond what people report. What's also interesting with this slow wave is that they're a phenomenon that we can try to pair with behavior, because these waves actually occur, usually last 1 second when they occur, which is pretty much the length of a trial, of an opportunity to respond that we give to participants. So what we can do is that for every digit that we present to participants, we can look for where we find this slow wave on the head of participants, and we can use that information to try to predict the response, whether people are, for example, missing a trial or whether they are responding when they are not supposed to, so doing a false alarm. And we can build statistical maps showing not only if waves are predictive of behavior, but where they are predictive of what kind of behavior. So really trying to guess, will my subject miss that trial? Will my subject make a false alarm? And when we do that, what we can see is actually these types of maps. For example, when we detect slow wave in the front of the brain, we can detect above chains whether people are going to be impulsive, whether they are going to respond when they are not supposed to respond. But when we detect the waves in the back of the brain, we're able to predict another type of error, which is a miss. So when they're forgetting to respond, or when they're too slow that they could not respond to the trial. And when we look at reaction times, we can actually see that slow wave detected in the front of the brain are predictive of an acceleration of reaction time, whereas in the back of the brain, predictive of a slowdown of reaction time. So really, we are here in an interesting position because we can record an event that looks like a sleep event, but in wakefulness. And whether, depending on where it occurs on the scalp of participants, we're able to predict not only when they are making errors, but what kind of errors they're about to make, which could be very interesting in everyday life situations like driving a car or attending a meeting or a class. But it doesn't stop there. Slow waves can also predict subjective experience. By subjective experience here, I mean whether your mind is wandering to other thoughts or whether your mind goes blank. This is a result we get. So when we look at the several seconds before interrupting people, and if we recall where this slow wave occur, we have the ability to predict both mind wandering and mind blanking, again, depending on where we find these waves. Not so much in terms of the number of waves, but more their amplitude and slope, so how big they are, how important they are. Especially when we find big waves in frontal parts of the brain, usually this is associated with mind wandering. Whether when we find this wave in the back of the brain, it's more associated with mind blanking. So we again found this divide between front and back, as if fatigue could be expressed in the same way in both brain regions. So it's always a slow wave, but the consequence of that fatigue depends on the job these brain regions are doing. When you have this sleep intrusion in frontal parts of the brain, which are brain regions that are very important for executive control. So monitoring your own behavior and not responding when you're not supposed to respond. Then when you have a disruption of these brain regions, what you would have is impulsivity, false alarms, mind wandering. But if the sleep intrusions are occurring in the back of the brain, what you have then is more a problem of sluggishness. People will miss information, they will have blanks, though they are in a way perhaps closer to falling completely asleep. So one mechanism here could have different and explain our different cognitive consequences based on which brain region it is affecting. We are very interested in the clinical applications of these findings. First, for example, in attentional deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD. This is because ADHD is currently more and more conceptualized as a dysregulation of arousal. So you're either too awake in a way or too asleep. And ADHD patients, both adults and children, have a huge amount of sleep disturbances, half of them, which is way above the general population. So what we are currently investigating is whether the attentional deficit could be actually related to the sleep disturbances, and whether well, for the sake of time, I will skip this to present this slide, whether part of their disorder is because they actually sleep bad at night perhaps because some of their brain region are waking up while they sleep, and this will have the direct consequences of making these brain regions sleepier during the day, more sleep intrusion, and more disruption of their cognitive processes. So it's something we're studying here in Paris in collaboration with a laboratory in Australia, where we thought that ADHD adults, unsurprisingly, are more impulsive. They make more false alarms. And this is associated with here a larger slow waves at the scalp level. So by recording this sleep activity in wakefulness, we're able to, in a way, predict or whether a person has ADHD or not. And we're also able to predict how much of an attentional deficit they have, because there is a positive correlation between the number of these waves and the attentional deficits. Now, if you have too much slow waves in a way during the day, is there something we can do about it? Can we use drugs, for example, to reduce sleep intrusion? That's a recent study we just published, where we took healthy individuals and we gave them different drugs to try to tap into different neuromodulators, either modulators that are promoting arousal, like methylphenidate, atomoxetine, or drugs that are decreasing arousal, like citalopram that acts on serotonin. We have participants taking these different drugs in different sessions. We have a control with a placebo, and we ask them to do attentional task to monitor their performance when they're required to do to exert their attention for long periods of time. And what we have is different patterns of behavior. So methylphenidate, which is a stimulant, improve their performance. People are missing less trials, they are faster without being impulsive. So overall, it's a positive improvement. Atomoxetine, curiously, didn't really improve performance. It actually made people too impulsive. So it's in a way going too much in the other direction. They're perhaps a bit too aroused. While citalopram decreased performance in the other direction, people starting slowing down, being a bit sluggish and losing information. So here we take healthy individuals and we can try to push them in various directions, either by making them too awake in a way or making them a bit sleepy. What's interesting is that we can map this out with changes in neural dynamics, and especially in the occurrence of these slow waves. What we saw, for example, is if you give drugs that activates or arouse people like methylphenidate and atomoxetine, then you will see a reduction of these slow waves. But if you give a drug that tends to get people a bit sleepy, then you will increase the number of these slow waves. So this slow wave is not something that will only increase if you spend a long time awake. It's also something that can be modulated externally here through drugs. And it can be relevant to behavior and performance because what we saw is that these waves actually, again, like the other study, could predict the pattern of behavioral errors that participants are making in this long, strenuous task. Especially waves in the back of the brain were predictive of slowing down of performance, whereas waves in the front of the brain were predictive of an acceleration of reaction times and impulsivity. And this is something that is quite specific to slow wave. If we take other typical marker of vigilance, like alpha oscillation, which is a visual rhythm in the back of the brain that is very sensitive to your level of vigilance, we can predict some behavioral errors, but not all of them. In particular, we can predict that people are slowing down, not when they're speeding up. But importantly, slowing down and speeding up are both consequences of fatigue that can occur at the same time. Being fatigued is being both, it's being extreme, either too fast or too slow. So it's important to be able to predict these two directions of fatigue. So we are hopeful that with slow wave, we can actually have a mechanism for fatigue that could explain the many consequences of fatigue, not only the consequences in terms of behavior, but also the consequences in terms of subjective experience, whether you have the tendency to mind wander or to mind blank. And we think that this framework could actually be quite interesting to describe a bit the dynamics of being awake, of our performance, of our consciousness. It could also be a good way to explain why we're getting tired in the first place. Why is it so that our brains are not able to sustain performance for long hours? Maybe this slow wave can actually indicate us that there is a profound change, maybe a metabolic change, maybe a plastic change that actually changes the very dynamics of our neurons, making it difficult to sustain an optimal level of performance. And finally, we hope to use this slow wave as a predictor of cognitive performance, but when focusing on clinical population, maybe also as a predictor of health, mental health, brain health. And we are launching a new project trying to use local sleep to investigate population with neurodegenerative diseases, including dementia, because this sleep intrusion could actually be one of the first signs that there is an imbalance in the equilibrium of neuronal dynamics, that something deep is changing and could be really revealed by this fading of the boundary between wakefulness and sleep. So it could be another biomarker that we can easily record that could tell us that maybe there is something wrong developing in the brain. So I would like to thank my collaborators in Australia, but also in Paris, where I've relocated, so the lab of Isabelle Arnulf and Delphine Diet, where we are pursuing these exciting ideas. And again, I would like to thank the Fondazione Prada for organizing this event. I'm very happy to answer any question you might have. And thanks to the local audience.
Thank you very much, Thomas. That was wonderful. We perfectly see what happens to somebody who is sleepy behind the wheel, missing things, being too slow to brake. But now if I am, because here we are speaking on neurodegenerative disorders, if I have memory problems and possibly mild cognitive impairment, could it be due in part to some local intrusion of sleep in my mind so that I could not recall what was shown?
So yeah, that's what we want to study, and I see two options here. Either we'll have a pattern, maybe like what I was presenting about the ADHD. So older people will have a greater difficulty to sleep deeply for reason due to aging. And that sleep difficulties was then translated into more sleep pressure during the day, more sleep intrusion. So in this case, we would expect more sleep intrusion in the elderly and perhaps explaining some cognitive difficulties. Or it could be actually the opposite, that the brain, when we age, has difficulty producing this slow wave because it's not an easy thing for the brain to produce this hypersynchronized slow wave. So they could struggle actually to produce this slow wave during sleep. So perhaps showing less slow wave, paradoxically, than an awake individual, but with less recovery than during the nights, which means less efficiency also during the day. There is something very strange when we age, that we become surprisingly good at handling sleep deprivation. So it's better to be driven at 3 a.m. by a 75 than a 25. Well, I mean, the ages are a bit random, but young brains are sensitive to sleep deprivation. Older brains are less. So perhaps it's because they do less local sleep, or perhaps they do more. And there is a mystery here that we need to investigate.
Thank you very much. That was really wonderful. Now it's time to turn to the next speaker, who is Dr. Laure Dubessy. Laure is a neurologist, senior neurologist at Saint-Antoine Hospital, and she also has a specific topic in multiple sclerosis, and especially fatigue and sleepiness in multiple sclerosis. Laure, thank you.
So, hello everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about my two favorite subjects in neurology, sleep and multiple sclerosis. So, why is it relevant to investigate sleep in our patient living with MS? One obvious answer is the fact that fatigue might be a sign of a sleep disorder, of course, and fatigue is also very frequent among patients with MS. As you can see on this well-known longitudinal study, fatigue is cited as one of their current symptoms by more of 80% of the patient, and it's listed as one of their worst symptoms by more than half of the patient. For around 15% of them, it is their worst symptom, meaning that some patients with otherwise mild disability will have a major impact of fatigue on their daily living, with repercussion on employment status, quality of life, etc. So, could sleep disorder contribute to fatigue in MS? This is what study from sleep centers suggest. Indeed, when we compare multiple sclerosis patients that come for sleep evaluation, the presence of fatigue is predictive of the probability to diagnose a relevant sleep disorder on the polysomnographic study. And the presence of a sleep disorder is correlated to the level of fatigue. So this might seem obvious, but sleep disorders are underdiagnosed in patients with MS. This is a nice epidemiological study that has its limitation because it's questionnaire-based, but still, more than 2,000 patients with MS answered questionnaires as screened for sleep problem. And as you can see, it's screened for a very common sleep problem, obstructive sleep apnea, insomnia, and restless leg syndrome. And for now on, I will talk about restless leg syndrome as RLS because I can't pronounce it properly. So. Altogether, more than 70% of patients screen positive for at least one sleep disorder. And this contrasts with the fact that less than 50% of them had ever discussed sleep issue with their healthcare provider, and only a minority of them were properly diagnosed with and treated for a sleep disorder. So there is room for improvement, but we can ask ourselves, what do we tend to underdiagnose patients with MS for their sleep disorder? Probably because we know that MS-related fatigue is hard to treat. And so here you have a small sample of what PubMed can provide you for the solution for MS-related fatigue. It goes from ketamine to saffron syrup, but it also more conventional therapy have been evaluated, of course, like wake-promoting agents like methylphenidate or modiodate. But despite some encouraging results in small series or phase 2 study, robustly constructed phase 3 clinical trials have so far been proven to be negative. And this is the latest robust clinical trial published to date in 2020 in Lancet Neurology. And to make a long story short, the three most popular drugs for fatigue, for MS-related fatigue, amantadine, modafinil, and methylphenidate, proved to have no beneficial effect on the treatment of fatigue related to MS. So is it the end of the story? Maybe, maybe not. We will go back to that later. So there is also room for hope, because if we identify sleep disorder and if we treat them appropriately, here it was sleep disorder, the sleep disorder that were treated were obstructive sleep apnea, RLS, and insomnia, so nothing too complicated. It improved, what a surprise, level of fatigue, level of sleepiness, and quality of sleep. So we can really help patients. So we have to stop looking at the MS-related fatigue as a fatality that we cannot avoid, and start to ask ourselves, is there a relevant sleep disorder in this patient? And what are the sleep disorders we have to look for in our patient with MS? Of course, the common sleep disorder that are shared with the general population: insomnia, RLS, sleep disorder, bruising, and also central disorder of hypersomnolence. And I will try to spend more time on the latest. So a quick word about an obvious thing. It is the fact that, of course, some patients have chronic symptoms that will impact sleep quality and sleep onset. If the patient has spasticity, neuropathic pain, bladder control issue, of course, it will delay sleep onset and it will alter the continuity of sleep during the night, and it will in turn causes fatigue and sleepiness. So you have to get these symptoms under control as the first thing. And what about patients who complain about insomnia, even when these perpetuating factors of insomnia are under control? So insomnia is a common disorder in the general population. In MS, it's hard to tell if it's more frequent, but it's probably more frequent than in the general population. But the good news is that it is accessible to cognitive behavioral therapy. Indeed, recent study, well-constructed study, proves that cognitive behavioral therapy, that is a gold standard for general population, in the general population for the treatment of insomnia, also works in patients with MS. So you should not hesitate to refer this patient to a specialist in CBT, and the patient will probably have an improvement of sleep efficacy and quality of life. What about RLS? RLS is this unpleasant situation sensation in the leg that is worse at rest, worse in the evening and early night, and urge the patient to move its leg to relieve the symptoms. So RLS impacts, of course, sleep onset, and it can impact the continuity of sleep when it's associated with periodic leg movement that can provoke microarousal and disturb sleep architecture and lead to sleepiness, fatigue, and lower quality of life the next day. The exact prevalence of RLS is hard to clearly determine in MS, but it's probably higher than in the general population. But it is otherwise the same that in the general population. It's associated with female gender, family history of RLS. It's probably more frequent when the disability increases, and it's linked to spinal cord lesion, especially cervical lesion. And some recent data shows that some specific lesions in the cortex are also predictive of developing an RLS. It is accessible to easy diagnosis through only clinical evaluation, and it's accessible to specific treatment. What about sleep disordered breathing and multiple sclerosis? So both the prevalence is very high in the general population, and again in MS it's hard to determine which what is a specific prevalence because it's highly variable across study. But there is a good chance that obstructive and central sleep apnea are more frequent than in the general population, and without any surprise, patients with sleep disorder breathing have higher score of fatigue. The mechanism include both central sleep apnea and obstructive sleep apnea, and it has been linked to the presence of brainstem lesion, which increase frequency and severity of sleep disorder breathing for central sleep apnea, but also for obstructive sleep apnea. And what are the risk factors for sleep apnea among patients with MS? It's possibly linked to higher EDSS and disability. It is linked, as in the general population, with older age, higher BMI, and male gender. However, we should keep in mind that most patients diagnosed in study investigating sleep disorder breathing and MS are female with quote-unquote low BMI. Indeed, here you have a diagram that recapitulates data of SDB prevalence among patients in available study regarding the mean BMI in the population investigated. And as you can see in those, I don't know if, no, we do not see the arrow, but as you can see in the middle of the diagram, I go back, there is some study where despite a quote-unquote low BMI of 26 and 28, so only patient being mildly overweight, you have a very high prevalence of sleep disorder breathing. So this suggests that there is something specific to MS that renders the patient vulnerable to sleep disordered breathing, and you should evoke sleep disordered breathing even if the patient is not overweight or obese. So let's go to central disorder of hypersomnolence. What are central disorder of hypersomnolence? I'm sorry for the part of the audience that is very familiar with this disorder, but just a quick recall. It is a group of sleep disorder that share a core symptom of excessive daytime sleepiness. And it includes primary disorder, namely narcolepsy type 1 and 2, idiopathic hypersomnia, Klein-Levin syndrome. And there is secondary disorder, namely hypersomnia due to medical condition, due to medication or substance, associated with a psychiatric disorder and insufficient sleep syndrome. And I will just make a quick recall about the phenotype you can encounter while looking for and diagnosing a central disorder of hypersomnolence. And for time and clarity's sake, I will focus on the two ends of the spectrum, narcolepsy type 1 and idiopathic hypersomnia with a long sleep time. In the middle, there is idiopathic hypersomnia with normal sleep time and narcolepsy type 2 that are possibly the same entity. It's still under debate, but actually they share common clinical characteristic. So the core symptom for all those pathology is excessive daytime sleepiness. However, the quality of the sleepiness really differs between the three phenotypes. On the one hand, you have narcolepsy type 1 patient who complain about sleep attacks. Sleep attacks are irrepressible bouts of sleep. It's an urge to sleep. The patient have major difficulty to overcome. Most of the time, he can't overcome it. And it leads to a short and refreshing bout of sleep. And after that, the sleepiness is transiently relieved. On the other hand, patient with idiopathic hypersomnia with long sleep time will complain of a continuous sleepiness. They say, I'm never properly awake. Sometimes it's better in the end of the day, better in the afternoon, but they describe a low level of arousal, and it can be described as cognitive fatigue, and it's hard for the patient to identify this as sleepiness because it doesn't have sleep attacks. What about associated symptoms? As narcolepsy type 1, hypocretin neurons are lost or decreased. There is a lack of hypocretin, and hypocretin as a function of sleep stabilization. So nighttime nocturnal sleep is disturbed. Patient may complain about insomnia. On the other hand, patient with idiopathic hypersomnia will have, by definition, a prolonged duration of sleep during the night when they are idiopathic hypersomnia with long sleep time, and they feel that like there is an increased efficiency. They report a very deep sleep that it's hard to end in the morning, by the way. What about associated symptoms? So in narcolepsy, there is a pathognomonical symptom of cataplexy due to the loss of hypocretin, and by definition, it's never present in idiopathic hypersomnia or narcolepsy type 2. There is also REM-associated symptoms, namely sleep hallucination and sleep paralysis, that are very common in narcolepsy type 1 and possible in idiopathic hypersomnia, although less frequent. What about daytime sleep? As I told you before, daytime sleep, daytime naps are beneficial for patients with narcolepsy type 1. It's part of the therapy. We advise patients, to take, to planify naps during the day to be able to be refreshed by this nap. On the contrary, patients with idiopathic hypersomnia tend to avoid daytime naps. Sometimes they can't overcome the sleepiness and they fall asleep, but when they do, sleep tends to be prolonged more than 1 hour, and at the end, they have major difficulty to emerge from sleep. It's not refreshing, and this leads us to the symptom of sleep inertia, which is very important to have in mind while evaluating for possible sleep, for possible hypersomnia. What is sleep inertia? It is a major difficulty to wake up after a period of sleep. I think we maybe all have experienced it once or twice in our life, maybe after a night shift, when we say, okay, I just sleep for 10 minutes on the afternoon, and we end up sleeping for 3 hours and waking with a headache and not feeling well fresh at all. This is sleep inertia, but some patients experience this every morning or after every nap, and it can take them hours to be properly awake. And during this sleep inertia, they have major difficulty to focus, to perform even simple cognitive tasks. Let's forget the complex ones. They can't drive a car, they can't perform correctly at work, etc. So this is a very debilitating symptom for patients with idiopathic hypersomnia. And by contrast, it's absent from narcolepsy type 1. And as I told you, idiopathic hypersomnia with normal sleep time and narcolepsy type 2 is a gray area in between those two extreme phenotypes. But for time's sake and clarity's sake, let's move to how do you diagnose central disorder of hypersomnolence. So the gold standard procedure for narcolepsy is performing a nighttime polysomnographic study followed by multiple sleep latency test or NAPS test. So polysomnography procedure will study sleep architecture and rule out other sleep trouble. And multiple sleep latency test, basically you give the patient five opportunity to nap during the day, and you record how fast do they fall asleep and the sleep architecture, which stage of sleep can you record during the day. And you end up with latency of sleep onset during the day, which is average on the 5 naps. And if it's inferior to 8 minutes, you have pathological sleepiness. And if in 2 or more excess of sleep, you have sleep onset in REM stage, by definition, you have narcolepsy. And what distinguishes narcolepsy type 1 and type 2 is the loss of hypocretin that you can prove either by spinal tap with low level of orexin in the CSF or clinically by the presence of cataplexy. And in narcolepsy by the type 2, by definition, you have normal level of orexin or no cataplexy. What about idiopathic hypersomnia? So you can see idiopathic hypersomnia as a narcolepsy without the SOREM. So pathological multiple sleep latency test and no or only one episode of sleep with starting with REM stage. But the problem with this definition is that when you investigate idiopathic hypersomnia with long sleep time, you discover that most patients have borderline or normal MSLT values. So these tests do not catch patients with hypersomnia with long sleep time. And the other way to diagnose, this particular phenotype is to perform long-term sleep monitoring with specialized procedure. So it's a long time recording. It is a PSG followed by multiple sleep latency test and then an ad libitum sleep, nighttime sleep and daytime sleep recorded for 20 hours roughly. So here in La Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital, that's the procedure we perform when we are looking at idiopathic hypersomnia with a long sleep time. So let's go back to MS. What about central disorder of hypersomnolence and multiple sclerosis? So it has been reported as acute onset of cataplexy or hypersomnia as a possible manifestation of neuromyelitis optica when there is lesion affecting hypothalamus or brainstem. This is quite logical because this is an area involved of wakefulness nets. So this is quite logical, and this is symptomatic cataplexy and clearly symptomatic cataplexy and hypersomnia. There is this other study that was published more than 10 years ago, and author claims that those patients are multiple sclerosis and NMO, but when you look at the brain scan, I think most of them now fulfill more the criteria of NMO, which actualize the criteria than MS. And indeed, acute cataplexy, acute hypersomnia is a symptom that is part of the diagnosis criteria for NMO. But what about MS and chronic symptom. Can the central disorder of hypersomnolence contribute to fatigue in MS? So we have one study that reports that there is coexisting narcolepsy and multiple sclerosis, but it's only limited. And to answer the question of the possibility of the possible contribution of disorder of hypersomnolence to fatigue in MS, a study that was published last year in Neurology, but performed a few years ago here in La Pitié-Salpêtrière and in Toulouse-Purpan Hospital was performed. To make a long story short, we recorded patients with MS that were either fatigued and sleepy, fatigued alone, or who did not add any complaint. And we ruled out differential diagnosis and performed long-term sleep monitoring. And if you look at the patient displaying fatigue and sleepiness, you realize that in the end, 10 out of 19 patients were diagnosed with either an hypersomnia phenotype or a narcolepsy phenotype. And of note, there is no, I didn't put the table here, but none of them displayed any symptoms evocative of narcolepsy, meaning they did not have any, hallucination, sleep paralysis, or so on. They only complained about being fatigued and high level of sleepiness at their Epworth sleepiness scale. So let's go back to this disappointing trial. As I told you, overall results were negative. But if you look at post-hoc analysis performed by the authors, you see here a diagram about, of recapitulating the fatigue score of patients regarding the under the different drug. On the left, amantadine. The second one is modafinil. Third one is methylphenidate, and last one placebo. In red, you have value of fatigue score from patients who were not sleepy at inclusion, and you see that whatever the drug being tested, the level of fatigue remains the same. However, when you look at the blue line, patients who displayed pathological sleepiness at inclusion had a beneficial effect of, both modafinil and methylphenidate. So this suggests that among patients with complaint of fatigue, especially when they are sleepy, there is probably a population of patients that have hypersomnolence disorders that can benefit for wake-promoting drugs. So now, I think I have just enough time for two illustrative cases that were referred to me for sleep evaluation. So this is a young woman that was diagnosed for MS in 2019. She had overall she has an overall low disability, and she was first referred for a second opinion about treatment. But in follow-up consultation, she started complaining of being fatigued. And when I asked her, she says that before the disease, she had an average need of sleep around 7 hours. She had no sleep difficulty, at least no problem getting up in the morning. She was borderline insomniac, and she works night shift without any difficulty in the intensive care unit. But since 2019, she experienced a pathological fatigue. And when asked, what is fatigue for you? She said, I'm not fully functional before lunch. I have the feeling that I am never fully awake. Sometimes I take daytime naps because I can't help it. I'm too tired. I'm too tired, so I do it, but I feel worse after that. And she said, yeah, and as I'm fatigued, I need more sleep. And indeed, she said she needed like 10 hours of sleep. And after 10 hours of sleep, she started needing several clocks. And sometimes she had her life partner to wake up to be sure not to miss important appointment. So, and ask about, she had no sleep attacks and no other symptoms. So she said, I'm very tired. And I was thinking, no, you're very sleepy. Let's screen you at Isabelle Arnulf lab. And indeed, we did. So here you have mean latency of sleep during the day. And as you can see, it's normal. She sleeps, she has a mean sleep latency of 15 minutes, which is perfectly normal. But when we record her nighttime sleep, she was able to produce almost 700 minutes of sleep during the nighttime and almost one more hour during daytime. So she had pathologically long sleep time during the day, associated with a complaint very evocative of an hypersomnia with long sleep time. So she was diagnosed with secondary hypersomnia, and she has a major beneficial effect of modafinil and sodium oxybate. And for the record, on another sleep evaluation before, she was able to produce 15 hours of sleep in a 24-hour monitoring. So, and I think if she hadn't complained about being fatigued, and if we hadn't asked a good question, she will still be not diagnosed, because she did not say, I'm sleepy, and she did not have any risk factor for other sleep disorder. So this is just one another case. This is quite similar. She's young. She has been diagnosed with MS since 2013, and she has a low level of disability. And one colleague referred her to me saying she has major sleepiness. So please check for her. So I asked her, what about your sleep? And she said, I'll always have been a good sleeper. I'm the marmot of the family, which is quite a transparent word, I guess, but it's groundhog, actually. And she says that since 5 years or so, her sleep needs have been modified. She feels fatigued and she mostly feels sleepy during the day. She goes to bed around midnight. She said, I'm sleepy since 11 p.m., but I like to go to sleep late. She sets her alarm at 7 a.m. She got up only at 8 a.m., but after that, she do not feel fully refreshed, but she's functional after that. The worst time at around 2 p.m., where when she can, she takes a refreshing nap, and it's improved her sleepiness status. And she's very happy about the COVID epidemic because she's able to sleep since she's working from home. So she also described very frequent sleep paralysis, occasional sleep hallucination, and occasional sleep fragmentation. She can wake up at 3 a.m. and have major difficulty to fall back to sleep. So at this point of the conversation, I was quite excited. I was like, yeah, this might be narcolepsy. But what is the question I need to ask this patient? So this is majority distant audience, so I will kill the suspense. It is, what about weekend and holiday? And she said, so because is this narcolepsy? But what about weekend and holiday? And she said, holiday are the best. I go to bed at 1 a.m. I wake up spontaneously at 10 or 11 a.m. I have no nighttime awakening because I don't think about work. I do not feel sleepy. I'm not tired. I have no sleep attacks, and even sleep paralysis and sleep hallucination are rare. So she only has insufficient sleep syndrome, which is a very, very common syndrome and responsible of a lot of the sleepiness among young adults. And of course, patients with MS are also susceptible to have this syndrome. So I did not address her to Isabelle, not because she would have killed me otherwise. And so let's move to the take-home message. I think I hope I have convinced you that sleep disorders are probably more frequent than we think about patients with MS, and it is worth trying to diagnose them, because it's quite easy, actually. You can ask simple questions to check if there is symptoms evocative of sleep disorder. Is there excessive daytime sleepiness? You can use screening questionnaires that have been validating for ARLS or obstructive sleep apnea or insomnia. It's still valid in this population. And in the end, if it is pertinent, you should refer those patients for appropriate PHG evaluation. And in particular, you should ask for long-term sleep monitoring if you suspect hypersomnia. And with that, hopefully, you'll be able to diagnose your patient properly with sleep disorder in a fraction of them and propose personalized treatment and really help this debilitating symptom of fatigue. And I'm sorry because I forgot the slide of of remerciements. So thank you, Isabelle, for this study and to invite me today, for inviting me today.
Thank you very much. And Laure, for sake of time, we will not have time for questions, but your case reports were typical of what a good clinician should do. So it's time now to turn to my own talk, which is about Parkinson's disease and sleep. I just need to put it back. Yeah. Is somebody doing it? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So sleep disorders are excessively frequent in Parkinson's disease, but they may be also prodromal to the disorder. So it means that they may appear years before the disorder. And this has been seen in several cohorts in the general population. For example, in the general population, having an insomnia increases your risk of developing Parkinson's disease by almost 3 times compared to not having insomnia. Having daytime sleepiness at the same rate, and having a blunted inner clock, which are people who are less synchronized in terms of sleep time, is also 3 times develop 3 times higher risk of Parkinson's disease. But having Rem sleep behavior disorder, which correspond to enacted nightmares during the night, has an odds ratio that is greater than 50. This is a very, very high risk of developing Parkinson's disease among all other sleep disorders. It's less common too. Now, once you have Parkinson's disease, there are several main sleep complaints. One is insomnia, which affects up to 80% of the patients. The second is excessive daytime sleepiness, and it's almost 1/3 of the patients who complain of it. And around half of the patients complain of abnormal movements and behavior during sleep. So if we come to insomnia first, which is the most frequent, it's also the less studied disorder in Parkinson's disease. In terms of what happens to the patient, what do they complain about? It's difficulty falling asleep, but this is very common in the general population. So it's not different from the chronic insomnia disorder. What is different is that PD patients have more frequent and longer awakenings during the night. It's what we call maintenance insomnia. And they have also more early awakenings than the general insomnia population. Now, having insomnia is common in the general population, and there are the same causes in Parkinson's disease, causes that are not specific to Parkinson's disease. With age, our sleep gets worse, and it is also the case in this patient. And these are very hard, debilitating disorders, so patients are often anxious, and up to 1/2 of them are depressive. So this might impact sleep typically. In addition, PD patients have causes of insomnia that are specific to the disorder, and they have to do mostly with the motor problem during the night, bradykinesia, tremor, dystonia, cramps, pain during the night, restless leg syndrome, but also the drugs we give to them may be deleterious for their sleep. For example, dopaminergic drugs have alerting effect in early Parkinson's disease, and they may link to dopamine dysregulation syndrome. Some example on the next video, you can see a patient during the night. That's what is black and white. It's in the dark. And she just tried to stand up during the night just because she wants to turn in the bed. And you can see what happens to simply change of position during the night, which is something you do in a fraction of seconds. It takes them minutes. And this can prolong the time being awake and changing of position during the night. The second problem is the bradykinesia, especially when they need to void urines. Then it's often to go to the toilet at the kind of age patient, but look, going to the toilet takes what? 2 minutes to somebody during the night, but if you have bradykinesia, you can see this patient needs help. It's really slow. It takes him time to sit and stand up and walk to the toilet. Now, you can see our patient who is awake at night and look at his hand. He has a severe breast tremor. And if this severe breast tremor occurs before sleep onset, it's very disturbing. Once he will be asleep, he will not have any tremor. It just reappears as soon as they wake up. And you can see here a patient, he has an arousal. He was quiet when sleeping, arousing, so a brief arousal, and you can see the tremor starting again. So all the Parkinsonism syndrome is appearing and being quite severe during the night. In addition, at the end of the effect of the DOPA, of the levodopa, you can have what is called a night or early morning food dystonia. You can see the twos here. It's very painful. It's like a cramp. And it does not wake up the patient during the night, but when they wake up in the morning, they might have it because it's a long time they have taken their last dose of dopamine. So it's a sign of dopamine loss. Now, restless leg syndrome, as you can see in this patient, is common in the general population, but it's twice more common. Twice more common in Parkinson's disease, especially when they are off, when they are bradykinetic. As you know, restless leg syndrome is more frequent when we are resting, when we cannot move. And this happens to patients with Parkinson's disease too, despite they are taking a lot of dopaminergic drugs. Now, there is something to check when a patient with Parkinson's disease has RLS. It's iron, and not exactly iron, but ferritin levels, which reflect the stock of iron in the brain indirectly. And as you can see, patients with RLS, PD patients with RLS, have lower stock of iron in their brain than those without RLS. So in this case, it could be useful to treat them, if necessary, with iron. Now, you can use a lot of scale to diagnose the problem during the night in Parkinson's disease, but the modified PD sleep scale is commonly used, and in this scale, investigating all causes of insomnia and also sleepiness in patients, the most frequent item that is checked by the patient is problem in voiding urines during the night. It's 80% of the patient would tick this box. Now, we mentioned as a cause of insomnia the dopaminergic dysregulation syndrome. This happens in young patients with Parkinson's disease and with high dose of dopamine agonist. Patients are excited, they are on their cell phone during the night, and they are also on internet, and they are somehow anosognostic of what happens to them, and they get sleep deprived because of that, because they feel well with increasing the dosage of dopamine. Dopamine has to do a lot with motivation, and this is like a too high motivation during the night. In addition, most people who don't sleep try to be on cell phones or on screens, and as we know, and as you can see here, cell phones are illuminated in LEDs, and LEDs are blue, in the blue color, And the blue color is something that is alerting, that is decreasing sleep. It's blocking our melatonin. So in addition to telling the patient, don't use a screen during the night when you wake up, just your lamp and a book, for example, or music. But in addition, if you use a screen before sleeping, which I would avoid in an insomnia patient, you can use some screen changing in the colors that are changing the background in something more orange. Orange is good for sleep, blue is bad for sleep. So you can have some application that change that quite rapidly. Now, bad sleep in patient, as a consequence, bad sleep in spouses, and we need a good sleep in spouses to give care to the patient. And really, the night of the spouse of a patient with Parkinson's disease, especially when they are more advanced in the disorder with a lot of bradykinesia during the night, it's really a nightmare. They must be there to help for changing of position, for helping for the toilets, and they get sleepy too. So now, in terms of insomnia and motor problems, the information is easily available via the interview or the scales. There's no need for sleep monitoring unless the interview is difficult or unless the patient is sleeping alone. And these motor problems are rather observed in severe advanced PD. Dystonia, bradykinesia, tremor, and RLS disappear during sleep. So at this point, you can choose either to improve motor symptoms at night, especially in advanced PD patients, or to increase sleep continuity, because if patients do not awake, they will not have a resuming of their bradykinetic problems. For improving motor symptoms at night, the general idea is to improve dopamine transmission at night. And there are many ways to do it. Usually, if patients have a long awakening during the night, we advise them to take an immediate release dispersible levodopa in a glass of water, because it works within 20 minutes and it's really helpful for patients to resume sleep after, because they are more relaxed and less bradykinetic. Using a slow release levodopa in the evening has really no clear effect. It's more an advertisement than a real effect. The deep brain stimulation, which is used day and night, have a robust benefit on sleep. It's one of the areas where the DBS is the most helpful. And you can use jejunal instillation of gel of levodopa and carbidopa, long-acting dopamine agonist, or apomorphine infusion during the night. Let's examine the data. Here is the first case where we switch on and or off the deep brain stimulation in the subthalamic nucleus in patients. And what you can see is the total sleep time. And when it's off, patients sleep less than 4 hours a night. And when it's on, it's almost 6 hours and a half. So you will never obtain that with hypnotic drugs, almost 2 hours more sleep, just because the STN stimulation is useful for the bradykinesia. It has no effect, no direct effect on sleep, just that this advanced patient are no more tremor, no more bradykinesia, no more dystonia at night. Now, using rotigotine, which is a dopamine agonist at night, slightly benefit on sleep versus placebo. This is the RECOVER study. You can see the effect on PDSS, it's a scale, and the treatment effect was -4 points above a total of 60. That's not major, but it can help some patients. We have the same results when looking at the effect of rotigotine transcutaneous versus pramipexole slow release. And you can see again a difference of here on the Parkinson's disease sleep scales of -4 points. Now, in the last year, under the direction of Valérie Cochin, we tried apomorphine subcutaneous infusion at night, not during the day, in PD patients who complain of bad sleep, even if they were not that advanced in the disorders. And it was on the double-blind randomized placebo-controlled study, a crossover. And here it's the PDSS change. and the perfusion were up to 5 milligrams per hour of apomorphine. Apomorphine has the advantage of being both efficacious on bradykinesia and sedative. And you can see the overall quality of life compared to the placebo was really improved as the sleep onset and maintenance insomnia. So the treatment effect was -10, which is larger than using high dose of rotigotine and pramipexole, which, by the way, they were already treated with. So it is added to the previous effect of dopamine agonist. Now, if frequent urine voiding is a main problem, so you can minimize fluid intake before bedtime, and some use some diuretics earlier in the day so that it will empty the bladder. The bedside common will avoid people to wake up and go to the toilets, which is hard when you have difficulty to walk. And you can use in patients who are not demented anticholinergics for nocturia. Now, the second way is to try to improve sleep continuity. And how can we do so? Nicely, an Australian team has recently studied the effect of regular exercise benefit on sleep in patients, and especially those with insomnia. And using 1 hour of exercise in the morning and one in the beginning of the afternoon resulted in a major improvement in wakefulness after sleep onset and total sleep time compared to simple sleep hygiene advices. We know that exercise benefits to the brain in general, but it also benefits clearly to sleep. You can also improve sleep continuity by treating concomitant depression and anxiety, and here antidepressants are useful. You have to treat coexistent sleep disorders using iron or gabapentin, for example, for restless leg syndrome. And there have been some small sample size assay of melatonin and esopicolone in the patient, which were beneficial to a certain degree. But our own experience in chronic insomnia is that using a small evening dose of antidepressant is more helpful than a hypnotic, and you're not at risk of tolerating the drug. What we commonly use in France is myoserine, 10 milligrams, but paroxetine may, at very low dosage, can also be helpful. And if the patient has concomitant hallucination and is in need for clozapine, which are hard to monitor because of leukocyte, you can have a major benefit of very small dose of clozapine to the brain, such as 1/4 of clozapine tablets. So this is for insomnia. Now, excessive daytime sleepiness. It's a second problem in Parkinson's disease, and it's around 1/3 of the patient on average of the study who suffered of excessive daytime sleepiness, and it can culminate in sleep attack in 1 to 4% of the patients. Sleep attacks mean that you fell asleep without any prodroma, and it's particularly dangerous when you are driving a car. And driving a car is important when you have Parkinson's disease because you have difficulty moving and walking. The frequency of sleepiness increases with PD courses, and what we found early in 2000 was that sleepy PD patients, 40% of them have a narcolepsy-like form of sleepiness. They might be able to enter directly into REM sleep and have short MSLT, as shown by Laure before, and this was often associated with hallucination at the same time, which could be considered as hypnotic hallucination. The mechanism of sleepiness in Parkinson's disease are probably multifactorial, like insomnia. These patients have insufficient or fragmented sleep, and this contribute to daytime sleepiness. The drug we use in them could have some sedative effect, especially in aged patients. But in addition, as shown with the narcolepsy problem, patients may have some lesion in the arousal and in the circadian brain networks, because not only the substantia nigra degenerate in the patient, but also other nucleus in the brain. If we start with insufficient or fragmented sleep, as Laure mentioned before, sleep apnea is a frequent cause of sleep fragmentation. However, it's excessively common in the age population. It's between 40 and 60% of the population, if you monitor them, who has some sleep apnea. So I would like to be cautious here and to say that it's a medical problem if apnea plus hypopnea occurs more than 30 times per hour of sleep before you are at high risk of treating something not important. And of note, 33% of normal women and 50% of normal men have an apnea-hypopnea index greater than 15. So here, in people who are listening to us and who are in very good shape and not sleepy, we might find sleep apnea, which is not a problem. So beware of not treating too much obstructive sleep apnea in patients in general. Here we have compared in 50 unselected PD patients and 50 sleepy PD patients compared to control. We have made systematic polysomnography, and as you can see, patients with the apnea-hypopnea index were lower in the PD population than in the general population, even when controlling for body mass index, and they had less frequent OSA. So from that, we can deduce that obstructive sleep apnea is not more frequent in PD, rather less. Now, what has been found by Valérie Cochin de Coq is that the most severe patients, the one with the highest UPDRS-3 scores, have more apnea, and it correlates well with the supine position. What we know is when you are sleeping on the back, your tongue goes backwards and will obstruct the upper airways. So we think that patients with Parkinson's disease who are on their back and have difficulty changing position, they remain too long on supine position, which promote apnea in their case. So rather than putting a CPAP on their face, you may use lateral positioning at night in this case, and that will avoid part of the problem. There have been some rare CPAP, randomized CPAP is the treatment, continuous positive airway pressure, randomized placebo-controlled study versus sham CPAP. It improves the objective sleepiness measured by multiple wakefulness, maintenance of wakefulness test, but it did not change any point at the Epworth, anything in the subjective sleepiness. It improves the sleep quality, but not the subjective feeling of sleep, and there were no change in cognitive performance. So this is for fragmented sleep. In terms of side effect, sedative effect of dopaminergic drugs, it was not really noticed under the levodopa era, and then we had the D2, D3 agonists that came in the 2000s, and here came a lot of description of sleep attacks, and this was more frequent with pramipexole and ropinirole, and with also bromocriptine. It was 2 to 3 times more than using levodopa only. So when we start with a levodopa agonist, we have to ask the patient about his sleepiness, to taper it very slowly, and to ask him not to drive when we are just starting the dopaminergic drugs. Now, this is a drug. This is fragmented sleep. Could the sleepiness be secondary to some genuine problem in the sleep and arousal system in the brain? Yes, probably. First, because here these were some monkey that were studied here in the Paris Brain Institute, and this monkey were a model of Parkinsonism using MPTP. And what you can see, the first one hypnogram is a control animal, and the second one is MPTP Parkinsonian model. And this monkey is really sleeping bad. You can see that he has almost no more slow wave sleep and very frequent awakening during the night. And this is during the night. Monkey, they sleep around 10 hours. And if you look at the other part of the 24 hours, here at the day, what you can see in the first part of the slide, a normal monkey has never any naps during the day, And the Parkinsonian monkey has a lot of brief sleep episodes during the day, which are either in light non-REM sleep or directly in REM sleep, like a narcolepsy. So basically, they have a repartition of sleep both during day and night, and it's not consolidated, it's fragmented, which is really remembering of narcolepsy. And indeed, if we look at the arousal system in Parkinson's disease, in neuropathology, they are affected in brain studies. For example, serotonin, which is an arousal system, is decreased by 1/3% if you count the neuronal loss in the brain. Norepinephrine, -50%, hypocretin, -40%, and this might explain the narcolepsy pattern we see in some patients. And acetylcholine in the basal Meynert nucleus is also thought to be an awakening system, and it's decreased. Now, when you see this problem of sleeping as much during the day as during the night, or having insomnia during the night and sleepiness during the day, it's remembering what we call circadian problems, problem with our brain clock. And indeed, we have this study from Alex Vidanovic, who tried to look at a marker of the circadian system, which are here the melatonin levels, serum melatonin levels. And what you can see on the slide, here is the time and time of the day, and this is the night. During the night, we have a lot high dose secretion of melatonin, and probably consolidate our sleep. And on the lower curve here, you can see Parkinson's disease patient, they are secreting the melatonin during the night and not during the day, but it's very blunted in terms of quantity. And if you compare the patient without sleepiness, which is the upper curve, compared to those with sleepiness have even more blunted melatonin secretion, which suggests that the pineal gland, which is making the melatonin, is affected by the disorder. So how to manage excessive daytime sleepiness? We have to warn patients for car driving. We have to try to improve nighttime sleep, but it might not be sufficient in most patients. We try to reduce dopamine agonists to switch them to levodopa when they are sleepy on dopamine agonist. And we can also combine dopamine agonist with either caffeine, which caffeine is easy to use, 200 milligrams, it's 1 mug of coffee 2 times. There have been some trial of stimulants which identified less than 1/3 of positive responder with modafinil and methylphenidate. Recently, a small trial of sodium oxybate, also with some mild benefit. If we think the daytime sleepiness during daytime has to do with an impaired clock, we might use light during daytime, and this was tried by the group of Vidanovic, a bright light therapy, and being stimulated during the day. Last but not least, in addition to insomnia and excessive daytime sleepiness, patients with Parkinson's disease have a behavioral problem during the night, which is called Rem Sleep Behavior Disorder, or RBD. RBD is affecting up to 60% of patients with idiopathic Parkinson's disease. It's even more frequent in patients with multiple system atrophy and dementia with Lewy bodies. So it's a clear marker of synucleinopathy. What happens to them? You will see a patient here is asleep, is in REM sleep, and is dreaming that he's attacked by a sarrazin, and is trying to defend himself with the tube of his CPAP. We can see movements can be quite violent. And of course, he can injure himself or injure his wife. He doesn't want to sleep with him anymore. So this abnormal behavior during sleep is associated with injury of the self or the bed partner. You can see here some patient who got some injury. They try to protect their bed to avoid falling from the bed. What happens to them? Well, if you look at normal REM sleep, we are totally paralyzed in REM sleep. It's called atonia, absence of muscle tone. And in those with REM sleep behavior disorders, muscle tone is here. It's usually flat, but at some moment it is increased. And in these moments, you have the reappearance of movements. It's like the lockers that prevent us to move and to enact our dreams is lost or partially lost. We know where the locker is in the brainstem because we know that from Jouvet early trials in 1955. Here we try to do several. Let's go back. To do several lesions in the brainstem, and it appears that just behind the 6 nerves in the junction of the pons and pedunculum, you have a specific area. When you damage it, the animals are enacting their dreams, and he did that in cats. I will not show you cats, but dogs who have spontaneously RBD, and I'm sure you have seen your dog doing that. You can see the dog is sleeping in REM sleep, he's on his side, and he starts to have some legs movements and to run as if running after rabbit. Bark. Out in the wall, exactly like our patients. So because this area was known in animals, the damage in this area was known to evoke RBD in animals, we try here at the Brain Institute to find a marker in this area, and this was possible with using 3D MRI of using neuromelanin sequences, which tag some specific neurons in the brainstem in the subceruleus complex, as you can see here. It makes signals that is visible in white here on the pons. You can see the cerebellum here, the foreventricle. And in patients with RBD, we have a decrease in this signal, which suggests that the area is damaged and has lost some neurons. In addition, in Parkinson's disease with and without RBD, the loss in the signal intensity is decreasing with the increasing of the REM sleep without atonia problem. So it's probably really like in animal. In Parkinson's disease, having an RBD in the 4 years of the disorder is a red flag. It's a red flag because those with RBD have a higher risk of dementia in the next 4 years of Parkinson's disease. You can see a patient without RBD in black and those with RBD in red, and it's 50 times higher risk of developing a dementia in the next 4 years if you have RBD, which is higher than the risk you have when you have MCI. So it suggests that the disorder is extended not only to this area in the brainstem, but also to the whole brain, and especially to the neurons that are implicated in cognition. In this study from America, the groups look at patients with Parkinson's disease with and without RBD. They look at the dopamine marker, that scan, serotonin markers, and they were exactly the same in the 2 groups. Then they look at the acetylcholinesterase markers, and they found, as you can see, that patients with RBD have lower staining of acetylcholinesterase positive neurons, especially in the posterior part of the brain, which makes sense with the cognitive profile we see in these patients. So having an RBD in Parkinson's disease is associated with a higher risk of dementia. It is also associated with a higher risk of hallucinations, as we found in this meta-analysis of all cases of RBD in Parkinson's disease. It's 2 times more. Hallucination is also associated with a higher risk of psychosis. And as you can see in this cohort, follow-up prospectively during 12 years in Sweden, having an RBD at the beginning of the cohort exposes you to a 4-time higher risk of developing a psychosis over time with your Parkinson's disease. And this is one of the main reasons to place a patient in an institution when he or she starts to have psychosis. So RBD is not good for Parkinson's disease, or at least it's associated with a more extended form of the disorder. Now, there are patients who come to us with just RBD during the night, no Parkinsonism, no other things. We call them idiopathic RBD. And the bad news is that these patients, when they come in their 50s, 60s, are much more exposed to develop Parkinson's disease and dementia with Lewy bodies. This has been confirmed by several cohorts in the world. In this one to which we participate, there was 1,000 patients with idiopathic RBD at the beginning here. And you can see that over time, here on each time you see a point, a blue point that goes down, it's one patient who had converted and developed Parkinsonism or dementia. After a median here of 7 years, half of the group have developed Parkinson's disease or dementia, and it's 92% after 14 years. So these patients are looked very carefully because, well, they are prodromal to Parkinson's disease. If you look in their brain, they recapitulate the theory of Braque, who first suggested as early as 20 years ago that Parkinson's disease might start from bottom to up, probably first in the gut, and then in the medulla, the pons, the pedunculum, with Parkinsonism started when the pedunculum substantia nigra is more than 50% affected, and then joined the rest of the cortex. Indeed, it's what is found in this patient when you use some brain functional imaging of fluorodopa, DAT scan, MIBG, and you can see that this patient with idiopathic RBD have already some neuroimaging marker of alteration in all these circuits in the brain, even if they have not yet any symptoms. For example, DAT scan here at the beginning of idiopathic RBD is considered to be normal. Here it's a transporter of dopamine, and after 1 year and a half of follow-up, patients start to have a decrease here in the DAT scan on one striatum. It's unilateral, typical of Parkinson's disease. And after 3 years, you can see that here the left striatum is already affected. In addition, using neuromelanin signals here in Brain Institute, we found that the substantia nigra that you can see in a normal subject here, it's what is blue here, contourned in blue in the peduncula. And the patient with idiopathic RBD, despite she or he has absolutely no Parkinsonism, has already lost a large part of his substantia nigra. In addition, patients with idiopathic RBD have oligomeric alpha-syn, which is the abnormal part of alpha-syn, which tend to accumulate in the neurons and leads to the death of the neurons. And you can already find this abnormal alpha-synuclein in the colon or in the skin, making a skin biopsy in the patients. How to manage RBD when it happens, whether in idiopathic or in Parkinsonian-associated RBD? Well, patients use a lot of things, like this patient using a specific belt and protecting his bed around. But in most cases, you need to use drugs. And these are the various drugs that has been tested, including clonazepam, zopiclone, melatonin, donepezil, and rivastigmine. Clonazepam is the most used. It's small dosage, 5 to 10 drops, but it can lead to apnea, sleepiness, and cognitive problems. Melatonin is our first choice, up to 12 milligrams. If it does not work, we turn to clonazepam. And I must confess that we had recent good results using gabapentin, 100 to 300 milligrams. So in conclusion, sleep disorders are excessively frequent and painful, and in Parkinson's disease, they may also affect the sleep of caregivers. It is an important part of the non-motor symptoms and burden, but the RBD is something new that opened a new window on presymptomatic PD and early neuroprotection. These are the patients who need to be protected in the future. And as we said, for MS, precision medicine is necessary. Each patient is different. Thank you for your attention. I hope I haven't spoke too much. Well, is it okay? There's time for one quick question. Oh, no, sorry. Too late. So I will give it's my pleasure to introduce my next speaker with Géraldine Rauchs. Géraldine is a researcher at Cicéron Institute in Caen, and she has done wonderful works on cognition and sleep, especially in Alzheimer's disease. Géraldine, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabelle, for this introduction, and thanks to the organizer for this invitation. So I will try to make my talk a little bit shorter. So I will talk about sleep and dementia, and more precisely sleep and Alzheimer's disease. So first, a summary of sleep disturbances in aging and AD. So it is well known that sleep complaint is very common in older adults and affects about 50% of people aged over 60 years. With age, sleeps become more fragmented, and there also a decrease in slow wave sleep, so N3, contrasting with an increase in lighter sleep stages, so N2 and mainly N1. And in patients with Alzheimer's disease, sleep changes are an exaggeration of changes that normally occur during aging. And we also see a decrease in Rem sleep. And I will talk a little bit about that at the end of my talk, but sleep apnea is also very common in patients with Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease is characterized by a long preclinical phase. Cognitive symptoms can be detected years before dementia, and abnormal biomarkers can also be seen before the dementia stage. And this long preclinical phase can be seen as an opportunity to identify risk factors and propose interventions to prevent AD and cognitive decline. And among these risk factors, sleep disturbances are receiving increasing interest. So I will first present you a few epidemiological studies. So this first study was conducted by Séverine Sabia on the Whitehall-2 study. They included around 8,000 participants that were followed up during 25 years. And they asked questions about their habitual subjective sleep duration at age 50, 60, and 70. And they identified different sleep patterns among individuals. So those with persistent short sleep duration, normal sleep duration, or long sleep duration, and those who change their sleep patterns over time. So change from normal to short, from short to normal, or from normal to long. So first, they investigated the association between sleep duration at each time point and the risk of dementia. And they found that there was a higher dementia risk associated with a short sleep duration at age 50 and 60. So short sleep duration in this study was defined as sleeping less or a maximum of 6 hours per night. And you can see that there is also a trend for long sleep duration at 50. Then they investigated trajectories of sleep duration between age 50 and 70, and they found that persistent short sleep duration at 50, 60, and 70 compared to normal sleep duration was associated with a 30% increased risk of dementia. There is also this study that was conducted in the team of Yves Dauvilliers and Isabelle Josson in Montpellier, who provided evidence of an association between a long sleep duration this time and the risk of dementia. So both short sleep duration and long sleep duration may increase the risk of developing dementia. Other data indicate that individuals with high sleep fragmentation may have an increased risk of developing cognitive deficit or Alzheimer's disease. So this study was conducted with actimetry, and they found that people with a high sleep fragmentation index have an increased risk of AD and an increased risk of cognitive decline over time. And these results were replicated by several teams. Now I will present you some neuroimaging studies assessing the association between sleep disturbances and brain alterations. So in this first study, the authors compared regional brain volume between poor sleepers and normal sleepers. And they found that poor sleep quality was associated with gray matter atrophy in some brain areas that are vulnerable to AD, so notably the hippocampus, but also in other brain areas less related to AD. In this other study conducted by Claire Sexton, they investigated the association between sleep complaint and brain alteration. Sleep complaint was assessed using the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, and they found at baseline that there is a correlation between poor sleep quality and the atrophy in the right superior frontal cortex. And participants were followed up during 3.5 years, and they found that poor sleep quality was associated with an increased rate of atrophy within widespread frontal, temporal, and parietal regions. In the same vein, Spira and co-workers found that sleep duration, short sleep duration or long sleep duration increased the rate of gray matter atrophy within frontal and temporal regions. Now we will look at the association between sleep disturbances and amyloid pathology. So the first evidence of such an association came from this seminal paper by Kang and colleagues in 2009. So this study was conducted in a mouse model of AD, and they found that amyloid beta levels fluctuate in the interstitial fluid according to the sleep-wake cycle. And they also found that beta levels are positively correlated with time spent awake during the night and negatively with time spent asleep, and more precisely with time spent in non-REM sleep. They also found that total sleep deprivation increased beta levels by 20–25%, and also that chronic sleep restriction, which is a situation that is more common in our modern societies. So if you perform a chronic sleep restriction during 21 days in the mouse model of AD, you will see an increase in amyloid burden in various brain areas. Studies conducted in human and using a measure of A-beta level in the CSF also reported an association between poor sleep quality and A-beta levels. And more recently, using a neuroimaging tracer using positron emission tomography, Spira and co-workers found that short sleep duration, so this is a right panel, is associated with greater amyloid burden in the posterior cingulate cortex of the precuneus and also in the prefrontal cortex, which are early affected in AD. So this result is consistent with the first epidemiological study I presented you, but it was not replicated by several teams, including mine, and especially by, in this study conducted by Audrey Gabel, they applied exactly the same method for data analysis and the same sample size, and they didn't replicate the association. So these results remain to take with caution. Other sleep parameters were also associated with amyloid burden. For instance, in my lab, we found an association between difficulties falling asleep over the last 5 years and amyloid burden in the prefrontal cortex. And these results remain significant even when we control for age, anxiety, depression, and the EPO status. And these results were replicated by another team in Australia who analyzed data of the eyeball cohort. And Bryce Munder in California showed that A-beta deposition disrupts non-REM sleep wave activity, which in turn reduces hippocampal activity and impairs the consolidation of hippocampus-dependent memories. So to finish with this series of studies about amyloid deposition, this recent study shows that the proportion of slow wave activity below 1 Hz and sleep efficiency predict the speed, so the slope, of subsequent amyloid deposition over time. Concerning tau pathology, there are much less studies because tau PET radiotracers were developed more recently, and the few studies that are available provided discrepant results. So the first one by Brendan Lucey revealed an association between amyloid and tau pathologies and decreased slow wave activity, and this effect was more pronounced for tau pathology. In contrast, in this study conducted by Joe Wiener, they found no association between tau burden and decreased slow wave activity, but they reported a significant association between tau burden and the coupling between slow waves and sleep spindles. And finally, this same team reported that tau burden, but not amyloid burden, was associated with worse objective sleep quality, so measured with actigraphy. So this is this panel. They also reported that both amyloid and tau burdens were associated with worse self-reported sleep quality, and that amyloid burden predicted misperception of sleep, which is very common in older adults. So all this data indicate that the relationship between sleep and amyloid and tau pathology are quite complex. Now I would like to make a short focus on sleep apnea, because sleep apnea is very common in older adults and is also particularly frequent in patients with Alzheimer's disease. So in this first paper by Ricardo Osorio, we can see that participants with SDB, so SDB or sleep apnea is the same thing, have an earlier onset of mild cognitive impairment and onset of dementia. In my lab, we are conducting a big European project called Meditating. So this is a project that is coordinated by Gaël Chetla, and it includes 11 partners in 6 European countries. And more precisely in Caen, we are conducting a study called Age Well. I will only describe the right part of the picture. So we included 137 cognitively normal older adults. At baseline, there were a series of cognitive tests, blood sampling, neuroimaging scans, and also sleep examination, including polysomnography. And after all this baseline examination, they were randomized in 3 arms. So one arm who practiced meditation during 18 months, another arm who learned English during the same period, and a control group. And they came back to the lab after the end of the intervention, and they performed exactly the same examination at baseline. So I will focus on baseline data. And when we performed the polysomnography recordings, we detected sleep apnea in a large proportion of participants. And we decided to investigate the pattern of brain alteration in people with moderate to severe sleep apnea compared to those with only mild or no sleep apnea. And what we found is that people with moderate to severe sleep apnea have greater amyloid deposition. They have also increased gray matter volume, brain perfusion, and glucose metabolism. And all these changes are colocalized in the same location in the brain, so in the posterior cingulate cortex and in the precuneus, which are known to be early affected in AD. So this study shows that sleep disorder breathing may increase the vulnerability of the posterior cingulate cortex and the precuneus to AD pathophysiological processes. And interestingly, this occurs in the absence of measurable cognitive and behavioral deficits. So there are no memory deficits and no sleepiness for most of the participants. In our lab, we started to do that a long time ago. We developed a high-resolution MRI sequence to precisely delineate hippocampal subfields and adjacent cortices. So it was something that was initiated by Gaël Chetla and Renaud Lajoie, and there is now a postdoc, Robin de Flores, working on this topic. And with this sequence, we showed that sleep apnea, reflected by the apnea-hypopnea index, is associated with a decrease in the volume of the hippocampus. So here it's the total hippocampus, but here you have also the volume of various subfield or adjacent cortices. And we have an effect also on CA1, which is the hippocampal subfield that is most affected by AD. And it is observed only in individuals who are already amyloid positive. And then we looked at the association between sleep apnea parameters and also hippocampal volume and cognition, and we found no association at baseline. But for the follow-up data, we showed that lower baseline whole hippocampal and CA1 volumes were associated with poor episodic memory performance at follow-up. So this study indicates that sleep apnea may exacerbate medial temporal lobe neurodegeneration in cognitively normal amyloid positive participants, which may in turn foster memory decline. So this also highlights the need to detect sleep apnea in older participants to prevent the risk of cognitive decline and ultimately Alzheimer's disease. There are a few studies about sleep apnea and tau pathology. So patients with sleep apnea have increased level of tau in the CSF, both cross-sectionally and longitudinally. For PET studies, there are only a few studies, and they provided discrepant results here again. This first study reported no significant difference in tau burden between participants with and without sleep apnea. And in this second study, they reported higher tau burden in the entorhinal and inferior temporal cortex in participants with witnessed apneas. So it's difficult to have a clear picture of this association because there are methodological limitations in these two studies. So here you can see that it was witnessed apneas, and there was no polysomnography too in the first study. So further studies are needed to better understand the association between sleep apnea and tau pathology. So to conclude, I hope I have shown you that sleep changes occurring in the course of aging are associated with brain alterations, some of them being in AD-sensitive areas, so in the frontal lobe, in the temporal lobe, and also in parietal areas, and more precisely in the posterior cingulate and in the precuneus. Sleep changes result in an increase in periods of wakefulness during the night that may exacerbate amyloid and tau release, and they also result in a decrease in time spent asleep that may compromise the clearance of toxic metabolites. However, it's not clear which sleep parameter is really relevant. I showed you some studies about sleep duration, about sleep fragmentation, non-REM sleep, SDB, but the results are not fully consistent. So it's not clear which parameter need to be targeted, and it's something that we have to understand to be able to propose some relevant interventions. The underlying mechanisms are still unclear. There are some hypotheses about inflammation, about the clearance of toxic proteins, but further studies are needed. And researchers in the field all agree on the fact that sleep and AD have bidirectional relationships. So sleep disturbances are a consequence of AD because brain alteration, including amyloid deposition and tau aggregation, will occur in brain areas that are controlling sleep-wake cycles, so they will contribute to alter sleep quality. But other data showed that sleep quality is altered long before the onset of cognitive symptoms, so and a few years before the dementia stage, and will increase the pathophysiological processes that increase our vulnerability to AD. So I showed you that there are associations between changes in slow wave sleep and amyloid and tau burden. But what about REM sleep, which is specifically altered in Alzheimer's disease? Actually, there are not much studies on this topic, but they provided interesting and promising results. So first of all, less time in rest sleep is associated with worse cognitive functioning in older men over time. Another study showed that lower REM sleep proportion and longer REM sleep latency increase the risk of dementia. And finally, this study by Brendan Lucy also showed that REM sleep latency is negatively associated with amyloid burden measured with PET. So now there is a need to develop interventional studies to determine whether improving sleep quality can slow down the progression or delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease. So as you have seen, we are conducting a study in Caen with meditation, but we don't have the results yet. I hope I can present you these results in a few years. And I would like to finish by a more positive note, because I think we should also investigate the potential modulation of the impact of sleep disturbances on brain and cognition by lifestyle. So it's something that we are investigating in my team in Caen with one PhD student, Valentin Rouy, and one postdoc, Julie Gonod. So actually, we proposed to our participants a questionnaire called the Cognitive Activities Questionnaire that is a proxy of cognitive reserve. So it assesses at different time points in your life, so all along the lifespan, how was your involvement in cognitive activities. And we stratified our participants in 3 groups according to the level of activity. And what we showed is that individuals with a cognitively stimulating lifestyle are able to maintain good memory performance even when they get low amounts of slow wave sleep. So these are represented by the green line. In contrast, individuals with a less stimulating lifestyle, though they are represented in red here, are more vulnerable to the effect of poor sleep on memory. So you can see that their performance decrease when there are low amounts of slow wave sleep. So this means that cognitive reserve may limit the impact of poor sleep quality on cognitive functioning. So it's a very interesting point, and we are now investigating whether we can have also a modulation effect on brain alteration. So I would like to thank all the people in my team in Caen, especially Gaël Chetla and my PhD students, Claire-André, Stéphane Réel, Valentin Rouy, Pierre Champetier, and Anaïs Hamel, and all the other members and the colleagues from the Meditating Research Group and all the funding sources. Also, thank you for your attention, and I will be very happy to answer your question.
Thank you very much, Géraldine, for this great talk and keeping the time.
We're on time, yeah.
Yeah, you're even faster. So, is there any question from the assistants? No? There seems to have been a lot of discordant results, but the most consistent one, if I don't miss, seems to be short sleep, no? It's the one where you show on time. Yeah.
Yeah, except for neuroimaging, but sometimes it's just, I think, a problem of statistical power, because neuroimaging studies are conducted in short samples. And I think we have to take into account sleep need, because for some people, sleeping 6 hours per night is sufficient, and for others not. So we have also to characterize the sleep phenotype of participants. This may explain the discrepancy.
But it's always difficult between somebody with short sleep and insomnia patient to make the difference. Do you have data on insomnia as being predictive of dementia? Because there is all these studies about hypnotics saying that they are bad for brains. I don't know if it's...
Yeah, it's true that there is some data about hypnotics. Actually, for insomnia, the evidence is not clear-cut too. In my cohort, I don't have any participants who have clinical insomnia. There are insomnia symptoms, and it's something that we are investigating. So I will tell you more in a few months, I guess.
Okay. Thank you. But we don't want to scare people with insomnia, telling them, oh, you're at high risk of Alzheimer's disorder. Okay. over question. I have a little question about sleep apnea. I'm not an expert in brain imaging, but so far I understood that the first cases with sleep apnea, who are not Alzheimer's disease, had abnormality on the brain scan, which disappeared after CPAP, which suggested they were reversible, possibly due to water or things like that in the brain, edema, and not directly due to a loss of cells. Can it apply to your study of the wonderful study of the hippocampus?
We don't know yet. It's something that we will investigate because we follow all the participants. I'm not sure that we will observe a complete reversion of some brain alteration, maybe some about the glucose metabolism, maybe, but if you have atrophy, we will see new neurons, especially in the posterior cingulate. So it's something that we need to investigate. At least I hope that CPAP will stop the progression of brain alteration. It could be nice if we observe that. Yeah.
Good, because Uncle Israel tried and it didn't work.
It didn't work.
No, but there might be more advanced than your cases, which are prodromal, which is more interesting.
Yes. But some of our participants had very high AHI, so it's really disturbing to see participants with such severe sleep apnea and no cognitive consequences.
Right. Okay. So if there is no other question from the floor, we will close the session and thank all participants and the audience for their attention. Thank you very much and goodbye and good sleep.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Should we quit? I don't know if Regia is online. Okay. Anyway, I'll quit.